The first-class cabin gleamed under the soft, golden glow of overhead lights. Plush leather seats, the scent of fresh linens, and the faint hum of luxury whispered exclusivity to all who entered. Flight 287 was ready for departure, and the energy in the cabin was a mix of anticipation and quiet entitlement. Ava Carter stepped aboard with the kind of effortless confidence that made people turn and notice. She wore a tailored navy blazer over a sleek white dress, her natural curls framing her face like a halo. A leather laptop bag hung from one shoulder, and in her hand was a first-class boarding pass, gripped lightly but with intent. Ava glanced around, her sharp brown eyes scanning the rows of seats as she made her way down the aisle. Passengers in first class shifted slightly in their seats, some with polite smiles, others with faint curiosity. Ava's presence commanded attention, but she seemed completely unaware or simply unbothered. Her demeanor radiated calm, but her movements carried a subtle precision, as though she knew exactly where she was headed, both in life and in this moment. She reached her assigned seat near the window, placed her bag carefully in the overhead compartment, and settled in. Pulling a slim notebook and pen from her bag, she began jotting down notes, her focus sharp. She didn't notice the sideways glances or the way the flight attendant paused when she entered the cabin. Miranda Scott had been working for the airline for nearly a decade. She prided herself on professionalism and maintaining high standards in her domain. Her crisp uniform, spotless and perfectly tailored, was a testament to her discipline. But as she moved through the cabin performing her final checks, her gaze landed on Ava, and something about the woman gave her pause. Miranda's sharp eyes narrowed slightly. She wasn't sure what it was, the polished demeanor, the quiet self-assurance, but Ava stood out in a way Miranda couldn't ignore. Unconsciously, her mind began to question, does she really belong here? "Excuse me," Miranda said, as she stopped beside Ava's seat. Her voice was polite, but there was an edge to it. "May I see your boarding pass?" Ava looked up, her expression calm but tinged with mild surprise. "Of course," she replied, handing over the slip of paper. Miranda scrutinized the pass as though it might reveal something suspicious. She frowned, her lips pressing into a thin line. "This is for first class," she said, her tone almost questioning. "That's correct," Ava replied simply, her voice steady and composed. For a moment, Miranda hesitated, her mind racing. Something didn't add up, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what. After a beat, she handed the boarding pass back without further comment, but her demeanor carried a lingering tension. Ava tilted her head slightly as she watched the flight attendant walk away briskly, her hands clenched tightly around the edges of her clipboard. Shrugging off the encounter, Ava returned to her notes, her pen gliding smoothly across the page. The minutes passed, but Miranda's unease didn't subside. In the galley, she spoke quietly to another flight attendant, her tone hushed but urgent. The two exchanged glances toward Ava, their expressions a mix of confusion and suspicion. Finally, Miranda approached Ava's seat again, her posture straighter, her tone more authoritative. "Miss Carter," she began, her voice firm, "could you step aside for a moment? I need to verify something about your ticket." Ava blinked, her pen pausing mid-stroke. "Verify something?" she asked, her brow furrowing slightly. "It'll just take a moment," Miranda replied, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. With a calm sigh, Ava closed her notebook, slipped it back into her bag, and rose gracefully. She followed Miranda toward the galley, the murmurs of nearby passengers following her like a trail of whispers. In the narrow space near the galley, Miranda folded her arms, her voice dropping to a harsher whisper. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to a different seat," Miranda said. "It seems there may have been a mistake with your booking." Ava tilted her head slightly, her calm composure flickering with confusion. "A mistake? I booked this seat weeks ago. It was confirmed." "I already checked," Miranda snapped, her tone growing colder. "This seat isn't appropriate for you. Please take a seat in the main cabin." The words landed like a slap. Ava's calm demeanor faltered for a brief moment as disbelief flickered across her face. She straightened, her grip on her leather bag tightening. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "My ticket is valid. Why would I need to move?" Miranda stiffened, her posture rigid. "Either you move," she said through clenched teeth, "or I'll have to call security to assist." Ava's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of quiet anger passing over her face, but she nodded once, silently, and turned back toward her seat to gather her belongings. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. She simply walked down the aisle toward the main cabin, her head held high. Passengers watched the scene unfold with growing curiosity and discomfort. Some cast sympathetic glances, while others quickly turned away, unwilling to get involved. Ava moved with dignity, but the humiliation was palpable. As she settled into the cramped middle seat Miranda had pointed out, Ava placed her bag beneath her feet and gazed out the window. Her expression was unreadable, her thoughts a storm behind calm eyes. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and began typing swiftly. A small smile, sharp and knowing, tugged at her lips as she hit send. Back in the first-class cabin, Miranda walked away, her shoulders slightly squared, as though she'd achieved some sort of victory. But as she moved through the aisle, a lingering tension in the air told her this matter was far from over. She didn't yet know that Ava Carter was already 3 steps ahead. And the game had only just begun. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, a monotonous background to the whispers and side glances rippling through the first-class section. Back in the main cabin, Ava Carter sat in her assigned economy seat, her leather laptop bag tucked beneath her feet. The armrests pinched her shoulders, a far cry from the spacious comfort she'd been promised when she booked her first-class ticket. Yet, despite the obvious discomfort, Ava maintained her composure. Her gaze drifted to the window, her reflection faint against the endless blue sky outside. Ava's fingers grazed her phone, which rested lightly in her lap. The message she had sent moments ago remained open on the screen. "There's been an incident. Please address immediately. I'll handle things on my end." She hit the lock button and slid the phone back into her bag, her movements deliberate, measured. Dos a two. In the first-class cabin, Miranda Scott exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She moved briskly down the aisle, her clipboard clutched tightly to her chest. A faint smile tugged at her lips, satisfaction at having restored order, though a nagging unease tickled the back of her mind. The other flight attendants were not so sure. Dennis, a senior attendant with years of experience, had noticed the exchange. His gray brows furrowed as he stepped into the galley to confront Miranda. "What was that about?" he asked, his tone low but firm. "Just a misunderstanding," Miranda replied curtly, flipping through her notes on the clipboard as if dismissing the topic entirely. Dennis wasn't convinced. "She had a first-class ticket. Why'd you move her?" "She didn't belong there," Miranda said after a pause, her voice dropping. "You know how some people, well, they try to sneak into places they can't afford." Dennis's lips pressed into a tight line. "You sure about that?" he asked pointedly. His tone suggested he wasn't asking about Ava's ticket anymore. Miranda didn't answer. She turned on her heel and walked away, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. Back in the economy cabin, Ava's calmness was unnerving to those around her. While some passengers watched her with curiosity, others quickly turned away, their discomfort palpable. Clara, a young flight attendant assigned to the economy section, noticed the tension. She had seen Ava enter the first-class cabin earlier, her confident steps unmistakable. Seeing her now, quietly seated in coach, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Approaching cautiously, Clara leaned down and offered Ava a small bottle of water. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" Clara's voice was soft, her concern genuine. Ava looked up, her eyes meeting Clara's with a warm, faint smile. "I'm fine," she said, her tone calm and reassuring. "Just a bit of a mix-up, I suppose." Clara hesitated, sensing there was more to the story, but Ava's composed demeanor discouraged her from pressing further. "If you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask," Clara said before stepping away, her chest tightening with unease. Ava returned to her notebook, flipping open to a blank page. Her pen moved with precision as she began drafting a letter. It wasn't for herself. It was for Clara, the only person who had treated her with kindness during the ordeal. Ava's jaw tightened as she wrote, the pen gliding across the paper like a blade carving out justice. Meanwhile, in the first-class galley, Miranda's unease grew. Something about Ava's departure didn't sit right. A voice in her head, a voice she wasn't ready to face, kept asking the same question. "Why did you do it?" Dennis returned, leaning against the counter as Miranda fussed with a tray of drinks. "You should know," he began, his tone calm but laced with warning. "Passengers like her? The ones who keep their cool, even when they're mistreated? They're the ones you don't mess with." Miranda froze, her hand hovering over a glass of sparkling water. "I was just following protocol," she muttered. "Were you?" Dennis asked, his gray eyes sharp. He didn't wait for an answer before turning and walking away, leaving Miranda alone with her thoughts. Ava's phone vibrated softly in her bag. Glancing around, she retrieved it, reading the response to her earlier message. "Understood. Reviewing the situation. Stay calm, and let us handle it." The corner of Ava's lips quirked upward in a small, knowing smile. She placed the phone back in her bag and resumed writing, her pen moving with quiet determination. Her thoughts drifted briefly to her father, Robert Carter. She could almost hear his voice. "You don't need to raise your voice, Ava. True power is in staying calm when others falter." Ava had learned that lesson well. The flight continued, the tension rippling through the cabin like an invisible current. Miranda avoided eye contact with passengers, her mind replaying the incident over and over. In economy, Ava remained composed, her notebook now closed, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Clara approached again, this time with a soft blanket. "Here," Clara said, her voice gentle. "It's not much, but I thought you might be more comfortable with this." Ava accepted the blanket with a gracious nod. "Thank you, Clara," she said, her voice warm. Clara blinked, surprised that Ava had remembered her name. "You're welcome," she said, a faint blush coloring her cheeks before she turned to assist another passenger. As the plane cruised over the Atlantic, Miranda's tension reached a breaking point. She had hoped to put the incident behind her, but the whispers among the passengers and the disapproving glances from Dennis were impossible to ignore. Then came the intercom chime. The captain's voice was calm, but carried a distinct authority. "Miss Scott, please report to the cockpit." Miranda froze. Her heart sank, a cold wave of dread washing over her. Without a word, she made her way to the front of the plane, every step feeling heavier than the last. In the economy cabin, Ava leaned back in her seat, her calm exterior unshaken. Her fingers lightly brushed against her phone, and she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She didn't need to raise her voice. The wheels of justice were already in motion. The door to the cockpit closed behind Miranda Scott with a soft click, but the sound echoed in her ears like a cannon. The enclosed space felt suffocating, the dim control panels glowing in the low light. Captain Reynolds, a man with years of experience and an air of calm authority, turned to face her. Beside him stood another figure, Dennis, the senior flight attendant who had been silently observing the incident. His expression was unreadable. Miranda adjusted her posture, her professional mask firmly in place. "Captain," she began, forcing an air of confidence, "is there an issue I need to address?" Reynolds folded his arms, his sharp eyes pinning her in place. "There's been a call from corporate," he said, his voice even but unmistakably serious. Miranda frowned. "Corporate?" she repeated, her stomach tightening. Reynolds nodded. "We've received a complaint about your handling of a first-class passenger, Miss Ava Carter." The name hit Miranda like a blow. She struggled to keep her face neutral. "There must be a misunderstanding," she said quickly. "Her boarding pass was valid, but there seemed to be a mix-up. I moved her to avoid further confusion." Dennis's eyes narrowed. "A mix-up?" he echoed, his tone skeptical. "Her ticket was valid." "There was no mix-up, Miranda. You made a choice, a bad one." The captain held up a hand to silence them both. "Enough. Here's what you need to understand, Miss Scott. Miss Carter isn't just any passenger. Her father is Robert Carter." Miranda blinked, her confusion evident. "Robert Carter?" she repeated, her voice faltering. "The owner of this airline," Reynolds said sharply. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Miranda felt the blood drain from her face as the full weight of the situation settled on her. The realization struck with the force of a tidal wave. This wasn't just a disgruntled passenger. Ava Carter was untouchable, her father's influence casting a long, unyielding shadow. Bei Sterdine Bama in the main cabin, Ava remained calm, her focus unwavering as she scrolled through her phone. She was not one for public scenes or dramatic gestures. Everything about her response was calculated, deliberate. Her father had taught her that strength wasn't in loud displays, but in quiet, decisive action. Passengers continued to steal glances at her, sensing that something significant was happening, but unsure of the details. The hum of whispered conversations floated through the air like static. Clara, the young flight attendant, hovered nearby, her worry etched plainly across her face. Finally, she approached Ava again, a cup of tea balanced carefully in her hands. "Ma'am," she said softly, "I thought you might like this. On the house." Ava glanced up, her warm smile softening Clara's nerves. "Thank you, Clara," she said, accepting the cup. Her voice was steady, with a grace that seemed to put others at ease, despite the tension in the air. Clara hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "I'm sorry for what happened earlier," she said in a low voice. "If there's anything I can do to help—" Ava studied the young woman for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You've already done more than enough," she said finally. "Kindness goes a long way, Clara. Don't ever lose that." The words struck Clara deeply, and she straightened with a newfound sense of purpose. Calm in the cockpit, Miranda was unraveling. "This can't be happening," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. How could I have known?" Dennis frowned, his disapproval evident. "That's the point, Miranda. You didn't bother to find out. You saw her, you made an assumption, and you acted on it. Now it's coming back to bite you." Captain Reynolds sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Corporate wants a full report when we land," he said, his tone heavy. "They've requested we ensure Miss Carter is treated with the utmost respect for the remainder of the flight." He leveled a sharp look at Miranda. "That includes an apology from you." Miranda's pride bristled. "An apology?" she snapped. "Yes, an apology," Reynolds said firmly. "You crossed a line. Now you're going to fix it, if that's even possible at this point." And the tension aboard Flight 287 only grew as the plane soared across the Atlantic. In the economy section, Ava continued to exude an air of quiet authority. She wasn't seeking revenge or spectacle. What she wanted was accountability, not just for herself, but for the countless others who might face similar treatment without the means to fight back. She glanced down at her phone, which buzzed softly with a new message. "Everything is being handled. Corporate is aware. Let us know if you need further action." Ava locked the screen and slipped the phone back into her bag. She had no doubt that her father's team would handle things swiftly and effectively. But later, Miranda made her way toward the main cabin, her steps unsteady and her heart pounding. Passengers turned to watch her as she walked down the aisle, their eyes full of curiosity and judgment. She paused near Ava's seat, her breath catching in her throat. Ava looked up, her expression unreadable but calm. "Miss Carter," Miranda began, her voice tight, "I'd like to apologize for earlier. I made an error in judgment, and I'm deeply sorry for any inconvenience I caused." Ava's gaze held Miranda's for a long moment, her expression unflinching. Finally, she inclined her head slightly. "Thank you," she said simply. The simplicity of the response was more cutting than any rebuke could have been. Miranda stood there for a moment longer, awkward and exposed, before turning and walking back to the galley. Hours later, as the plane began its descent, Captain Reynolds made a final announcement over the intercom, his tone unusually formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for landing, I'd like to thank you for your patience during this flight. We hope to make the remainder of your journey as pleasant as possible." The words were standard, but the weight behind them wasn't lost on the passengers, or on Ava. When the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, Ava gathered her belongings and rose gracefully from her seat. Clara stood nearby, watching her with a quiet mix of admiration and respect. "Thank you for everything, Clara," Ava said softly as she exited the plane. Clara nodded, a warm blush spreading across her cheeks. "Safe travels, Miss Carter." Miranda watched from a distance as Ava disappeared into the terminal, flanked by senior airline staff who had rushed to meet her upon landing. The realization settled heavily on Miranda's shoulders. She had misjudged Ava Carter, and it had cost her dearly. And yet, deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fallout was only just beginning. The airline's bustling terminal was a stark contrast to the quiet tension that had filled Flight 287. Passengers milled about, their voices blending into an indistinct hum, while Miranda Scott sat in an isolated conference room within the airline's administrative offices. The room was sterile, its beige walls devoid of any decoration, save for a clock ticking relentlessly in the corner. Miranda's reflection stared back at her from the darkened window, a woman who had always believed herself competent, professional, and above reproach. Yet, in this moment, her confidence was in shreds. She adjusted her uniform's collar, trying to reclaim some sense of authority, but her trembling hands betrayed her. Across the terminal, Ava Carter walked calmly through the VIP lounge. Her phone buzzed with messages from the airline's corporate team, each offering updates and reassurances. But Ava's focus wasn't on retribution. She had bigger goals in mind. Her father, Robert Carter, had raised her to think beyond herself. "Use your experiences to make things better, Ava. Not just for you, but for the people who come after you." The words echoed in her mind as she drafted an email on her tablet. She detailed the incident, yes, but she also included recommendations for systemic changes, mandatory training for staff, improved diversity initiatives, and clear policies to address unconscious bias. She finished the email and hit send, her expression calm but resolute. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. Meanwhile, Miranda's meeting began. Two airline executives entered the room, their expressions professional but unyielding. They introduced themselves, Mr. Hale and Ms. Trent, and wasted no time addressing the matter at hand. "Miss Scott," Hale began, his voice clipped, "we've reviewed the details of the incident aboard Flight 287. It's clear that your actions were inappropriate and based on an assumption that had no basis in fact." Miranda shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I understand that now," she said, her voice subdued. "But at the time, Trent interrupted, her tone sharp, "you chose to escalate a situation without justification. You treated a first-class passenger as if they didn't belong because of a perception rooted in bias. That is unacceptable." Miranda opened her mouth to respond, but the words died in her throat. What could she say? That she had acted on a gut feeling? That her instincts had been wrong? She knew it wouldn't be enough. Attendant that evening, Miranda returned to her small apartment, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She sat at her kitchen table, the room dimly lit by the glow of a single lamp. The disciplinary report sat in front of her, its cold, clinical language outlining her suspension and the mandatory sensitivity training she was required to complete. For the first time, she allowed herself to reflect deeply on her actions, not just on the plane, but throughout her career. How many times had she made similar assumptions without consequences? How many passengers had left her care feeling dismissed or disrespected? Memories surfaced unbidden. A man with an accent she'd assumed couldn't afford a business-class upgrade, a young woman she'd judged for her casual attire, a family she'd treated coldly because their children were noisy. Each instance piled on top of the other, creating a weight that was almost unbearable. Her hands trembled as she opened her laptop. A quick search brought her to articles and videos on unconscious bias, the very term the executives had used in their meeting. As she read, a harsh truth emerged. Her actions hadn't been isolated. They were part of a larger pattern, one rooted in societal stereotypes she'd absorbed without question. Fuck. While Miranda wrestled with her conscience, Ava prepared for a meeting of her own. She had requested a sit-down with the airline's senior leadership, including her father. This wasn't just about resolving her personal grievance. It was about creating a path forward for the company and its employees. The next morning, Ava entered a sleek conference room where a group of executives awaited her. Robert Carter, a commanding presence even in his late 60s, greeted her with a proud smile. "Thank you for coming, Ava," he said, gesturing to a seat at the head of the table. Ava wasted no time. "I want to address what happened yesterday," she began, her voice steady. "But more importantly, I want to address what it represents." She outlined her proposals: a mandatory bias training program for all employees, anonymous reporting channels for incidents of discrimination, and a review of hiring and promotion practices to ensure diversity at all levels. Her tone was calm but firm, her arguments backed by research and personal conviction. The executives listened intently. Some nodded in agreement, others took notes, but none dared interrupt her. When she finished, Robert leaned forward, his voice filled with quiet pride. "We'll implement these changes, Ava. You have my word." As the airline began rolling out its new initiatives in the weeks that followed, Miranda attended her first sensitivity training session. The room was filled with employees from various departments, all seated in a circle of folding chairs. The facilitator, a soft-spoken woman with a commanding presence, began by sharing stories of passengers who had experienced bias in subtle but significant ways. Miranda listened, her heart sinking with each account. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a broader issue she'd been blind to for far too long. When it came time for group discussions, Miranda hesitated to speak, but eventually she found her voice. "I made a mistake," she admitted, her voice trembling. "A big one. I didn't just misjudge someone. I dismissed their humanity, and now I'm trying to figure out how to make it right." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time, Miranda felt the faintest glimmer of hope, not for forgiveness, but for the possibility of change. In the days that followed, Clara, the young flight attendant who had shown kindness to Ava, received a surprise, a letter of commendation from the airline's leadership. Ava had specifically mentioned Clara's empathy and professionalism in her report, and the recognition brought tears to the young woman's eyes. "I was just doing what felt right," Clara said when her supervisor congratulated her. "That's what makes it matter," the supervisor replied. As for Ava, she continued to advocate for change, both within the airline and beyond. She knew that her actions had sparked a movement, one that was larger than any single flight or incident. And while the journey had been painful, it had also been necessary. Through quiet determination and unwavering grace, Ava had turned a moment of injustice into an opportunity for transformation, not just for herself, but for everyone involved. And for Miranda, the road to redemption was just beginning. The final approach of Flight 287 was smooth, but the tension on board was anything but. As the plane descended, the golden lights of the city glittered below, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside Miranda Scott. Every minute since the confrontation with Ava had been a slow, agonizing unraveling. The announcement about Ava's identity had spread among the crew, whispered in hushed tones as the reality of what had transpired sunk in. Miranda sat stiffly in the galley, her clipboard resting uselessly on her lap. Her usual efficiency was gone, replaced by a gnawing dread that grew with every passing second. The captain's warning about corporate oversight echoed in her mind. Corporate will want a full report. They're expecting accountability. Treat her with the utmost respect. The words looped endlessly, each repetition tightening the knot in her stomach. In the main cabin, Ava remained calm, her demeanor as composed as ever. Passengers had continued to steal glances at her throughout the flight, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and unease. She ignored them all, focused instead on the steady hum of her phone in her lap. A new message from her father appeared. "Team is waiting for you upon arrival. The situation is under review. Proud of you for staying calm." Ava allowed herself a small smile. Her father's confidence in her was a comfort, though she knew this wasn't about seeking validation. This was about ensuring no one else would have to endure what she had. When the plane touched down with a gentle bump, a ripple of movement spread through the cabin as passengers began to gather their belongings. Overhead bins clicked open, seatbelts unfastened, and murmured conversations resumed. But in first class, Miranda remained rooted in place, watching the activity with growing dread. The intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at our destination. On behalf of the crew, thank you for flying with us. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off, and we'll begin deplaning shortly." For Miranda, the usual announcement felt like a countdown to judgment. Tuktromaim. At the gate, two members of the airline's senior staff stood waiting, their expressions professional but firm. One held a tablet displaying notes from the incident, while the other adjusted her blazer, preparing to address Ava directly. As passengers began filing out, Miranda felt her heart race when she spotted the executives. She knew why they were here, and she couldn't avoid them. Ava rose gracefully from her economy seat, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder. Clara stood nearby, her hands clasped in front of her as she waited for Ava to pass. "Miss Carter," Clara said softly, offering a small smile. "Thank you again for your patience." Ava paused, her warm gaze meeting Clara's. "No," Ava said gently. "Thank you. You've been a bright spot in all of this. Don't lose that kindness. It matters more than you know." Clara flushed, her lips parting in surprise, but Ava had already turned and stepped into the aisle. As Ava approached the exit, the executives stepped forward. "Miss Carter," one of them began, extending a hand. "I'm Lisa Trent, VP of Passenger Relations. We're here to personally apologize for your experience on Flight 287 and assure you this matter is being taken seriously." Ava shook her hand firmly, her expression calm but unyielding. "I hope so, Ms. Trent. What happened today wasn't just about me. It's about the culture you allow to persist. That needs to change." The second executive, a man in a tailored suit, nodded. "We couldn't agree more. We'll be conducting a full review, starting immediately. And, of course, we'd like to discuss your input further when you're available." "I'll make time," Ava replied simply. She glanced briefly back toward the plane, her gaze landing on Miranda, who was hovering near the galley, watching the interaction from afar. Miranda felt the weight of Ava's calm stare. There was no malice in it, only an unsettling certainty, as though Ava already knew how this would end. Ichao. After Ava exited the plane, Miranda was summoned to the gate. Her hands trembled as she walked down the jet bridge, each step heavier than the last. When she reached the senior staff, they didn't offer the same polite smiles they'd given Ava. "Miss Scott," Lisa Trent said, her tone clipped, "we need to have a conversation about your actions during this flight. Follow us, please." Miranda nodded, unable to find her voice. In a private meeting room at the airport, the conversation was direct and unflinching. "Your behavior was unacceptable," Trent began. "You targeted a passenger based on an assumption, a discriminatory assumption, and escalated a situation without justification. This isn't just a mistake, Miss Scott. It's a failure to uphold the values of this airline." Miranda swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way," she said weakly. I thought, "You thought she didn't belong in first class," Trent interrupted sharply. "That's not an excuse. It's a bias." Miranda's face burned with shame, but Trent didn't stop. "This airline has worked hard to cultivate an inclusive environment for our passengers and staff. Incidents like this undermine that effort and damage our reputation. Effective immediately, you are suspended from duty, pending a disciplinary hearing." The words hit like a physical blow. Miranda sank into the chair, her mind racing. A suspension meant her career was on the line. Meanwhile, Ava was greeted by her father in the VIP lounge. Robert Carter, with his commanding presence and warm smile, wrapped his daughter in a hug. "I'm sorry you had to deal with this," he said, his voice filled with both affection and frustration. "It's being handled," Ava replied, her tone steady. "But this isn't just about me, Dad. It's about changing the system." Robert nodded, pride glimmering in his eyes. "And you're the right person to make that happen." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Miranda returned home, exhausted and overwhelmed. The sterile language of her suspension notice echoed in her mind. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at her reflection in the black screen of her phone. For the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had been avoiding. This wasn't just an incident. It was a reckoning. Miranda had spent years climbing the ranks of the airline, priding herself on her professionalism. But in one moment, her assumptions and unchecked biases had unraveled everything. She opened her laptop and began searching for information on unconscious bias. As she read stories of others who had been dismissed, overlooked, or mistreated because of their race, her shame deepened. "This isn't who I want to be," she thought, tears stinging her eyes. "It can't be who I stay." And so, with trembling hands, Miranda began her first step toward understanding and, perhaps, redemption. Miranda Scott sat in the back row of a modest conference room, a plastic cup of water trembling in her hands. The room was plain, cream-colored walls, a projection screen at the front, but its simplicity amplified the weight of what was about to unfold. Around her sat colleagues she didn't know, all of them summoned for the same purpose: sensitivity and bias training. This was her first mandatory session since her suspension, and Miranda's chest tightened as the facilitator, a poised woman named Janine, began speaking. "Thank you all for being here today," Janine said, her voice calm yet commanding. "This is a space for reflection and growth, not judgment. But growth doesn't happen without honesty, so I encourage you to challenge your assumptions and yourselves." Miranda shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had spent the days since her suspension wrestling with shame and regret. She had thought about Ava Carter often, her poise, her calm gaze that had said so much without a single word of anger. For the first time, Miranda truly wondered, what must it have felt like to sit in that economy seat, knowing you belonged somewhere else? As the session progressed, Janine shared stories of passengers who had experienced discrimination, from microaggressions to outright hostility. Each story felt like a small dagger to Miranda's heart. A video was played of a passenger recounting a similar experience to Ava's, being asked to move from first class despite having a valid ticket, simply because the flight attendant assumed they didn't belong. "It's not about the seat," the passenger said in the video. "It's about dignity. When someone looks at you and decides you're less than, it's not just insulting, it's dehumanizing." The words hit Miranda like a wave. Dehumanizing. That was exactly what she had done to Ava, whether she had intended to or not. When it was time for group discussions, Miranda hesitated. The facilitator asked them to share a time they had witnessed or contributed to bias, and the room fell into a tense silence. Finally, Miranda spoke, her voice trembling. I made a mistake," she began, staring at the table in front of her. "A big one. There was a passenger on my flight, a first-class passenger, and I made an assumption about her. I thought she didn't belong, and because of that, I humiliated her. I treated her like she was less than." Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. The room remained quiet, giving her space to continue. "It wasn't until later that I realized how wrong I was. She didn't yell, didn't argue. She just let me hang myself with my own actions." Miranda's voice cracked slightly. "I've spent every day since thinking about what I could have done differently, how I could have been better." Janine nodded, her expression understanding but firm. "Acknowledging your actions is the first step, but what matters most is what you do moving forward. It's not about erasing the past, it's about ensuring it doesn't happen again." Miranda swallowed hard, her resolve quietly forming. While Miranda was beginning her journey of self-reflection, Ava Carter was busy turning the incident into something larger. At her father's suggestion, she had agreed to join a task force at the airline, overseeing the implementation of new diversity and inclusion initiatives. Her first meeting with the task force was productive, but tense. Ava's presence carried weight. Everyone in the room knew her name and the power behind it. But Ava's focus wasn't on wielding her influence. It was on making meaningful change. "These aren't just policies," Ava said, gesturing toward a document outlining proposed training programs. "These are commitments. If we want our passengers and employees to trust us, we need to earn that trust. Every single day." The executives around the table nodded, though some with more enthusiasm than others. Ava had anticipated resistance. Change wasn't easy, especially for an institution as large as an airline, but she wasn't deterred. Clara, the young flight attendant who had shown Ava kindness during the flight, was one of the first beneficiaries of the new initiatives. Ava had ensured that Clara's professionalism and empathy were highlighted in her report to corporate. Weeks later, Clara received an unexpected promotion to senior flight attendant. When her supervisor handed her the letter of recognition, Clara's eyes filled with tears. "You've earned this," the supervisor said warmly. Clara thought back to Ava's words. Kindness goes a long way. For Miranda, the weeks of suspension were grueling but transformative. Outside of the mandatory training sessions, she threw herself into volunteer work, assisting at a community center that focused on racial equity and education. One afternoon, while organizing a donation drive, Miranda had a conversation with a young woman who reminded her of Ava. The woman, a college student, shared her struggles with being underestimated and dismissed because of her background. "I just want people to see me for who I am," the student said, her voice filled with quiet frustration. Miranda nodded, her chest tightening. "I'm starting to understand what that means," she said softly. The student smiled, her expression warm. Understanding is the first step. When the day of Miranda's disciplinary hearing finally arrived, she entered the sterile conference room with her head held high. She wasn't the same person who had walked off Flight 287 weeks ago. The panel questioned her extensively about her actions, her reflections, and the steps she had taken since. Miranda answered honestly, admitting her faults without defensiveness. "Do you believe you've learned from this experience?" one of the panelists asked. "I do," Miranda replied. "But learning isn't enough. I want to make sure I use what I've learned to be better, for myself, for my colleagues, and for every passenger I serve." The panelists exchanged glances before concluding the hearing. Miranda wouldn't know their final decision for a few days, but regardless of the outcome, she felt a strange sense of peace. Baso that evening, Miranda wrote a letter to Ava. "Dear Miss Carter, I owe you an apology, not just for what I did, but for what it represented. My actions were inexcusable, and I failed to see you as the person you are. I acted on assumptions rather than facts, and I let my own biases cloud my judgment. Since that day, I've worked to confront those biases and learn from my mistakes. It's a journey I'm still on, but I wanted you to know that your grace and composure during that flight inspired me to be better. I can't undo what I did, but I can promise to do everything in my power to ensure no one else has to go through what you did. Thank you for showing me what true dignity looks like. Sincerely, Miranda Scott." As she sealed the envelope, Miranda felt a weight lift. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning. And beginnings, she realized, were where hope lived. The coffee shop was quiet, save for the gentle hum of conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine. Ava Carter sat at a corner table, her tablet open in front of her. The screen displayed a draft of a proposal, a new initiative to improve diversity in hiring practices across the airline industry. Her cappuccino sat untouched, steam curling lazily upward as she focused on polishing her ideas. The past weeks had been a whirlwind. Between her role on the airline's diversity task force and managing her father's charitable foundation, Ava had barely had time to breathe. Yet, she thrived in the challenge, knowing her efforts would ripple far beyond her own experience. The door jingled softly as a new customer entered. Ava didn't look up until she heard a familiar voice, a voice she hadn't expected to hear again. Miranda Scott froze the moment she spotted Ava. She had been walking toward the counter, her mind occupied with errands and thoughts of her recent disciplinary hearing. But now she felt as though she were rooted to the floor. There she was, the woman whose quiet grace had unraveled Miranda's carefully constructed world. Ava was every bit as composed as Miranda remembered, her presence commanding without effort. For a moment, Miranda considered turning around and walking out. She didn't know if Ava would even want to see her, let alone hear what she had to say. But something deep inside urged her forward. With a deep breath, Miranda approached the corner table. "Miss Carter?" Miranda's voice was hesitant, but Ava looked up immediately. For a brief moment, her expression was unreadable, but then recognition softened her gaze. "Miss Scott," Ava said evenly, closing her tablet. "This is unexpected. Miranda began, then faltered. She clasped her hands tightly, summoning her courage. "I know this is uninvited, but could I speak with you for a moment?" Ava gestured to the seat across from her. "Go ahead." Miranda sat, her posture tense. For a moment the words wouldn't come, but Ava's calm expression encouraged her to continue. "I wanted to apologize," Miranda said finally. Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. "Not just for what happened on the flight, but for what it revealed about me. I made assumptions, hurtful ones, and I acted on them without thinking. You deserved better than that." Ava's gaze remained steady, but she didn't interrupt. "I've spent the last few weeks reflecting, going through training, trying to understand how I ended up there, how I let my biases guide my actions," Miranda continued. "It's been humbling and painful, but it's necessary." She paused, looking down at her clasped hands. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I'm working to change. I'm trying to be better." Ava studied Miranda, her expression thoughtful. She could see the sincerity in the woman's eyes, the weight of genuine remorse. "Do you know why I didn't raise my voice on that flight?" Ava asked finally. Miranda shook her head. "Because I knew it wouldn't change your mind," Ava said simply. "I've learned over the years that when someone like you makes up their mind about someone like me, words don't matter. Actions do." Miranda nodded slowly, her face pale. "But I also believe in second chances," Ava continued. Her voice softened, though her gaze remained firm. "And in using those chances to make a difference, the fact that you're here, saying this to me now, tells me you've started that process. I respect that." Miranda looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. "That said," Ava added, "growth isn't a moment. It's a practice. I hope you'll keep at it. Not just for yourself, but for the people you serve every day." "I will," Miranda said earnestly. "I promise." And their conversation shifted into something more natural, though the tension never entirely left. Miranda asked about Ava's work with the task force, and Ava shared her goals for systemic change within the airline industry. Miranda listened intently, her respect for Ava deepening with every word. When their talk came to an end, Miranda stood and offered her hand. "Thank you for hearing me out," she said, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. Ava shook her hand firmly. "Thank you for taking the time to reflect, and for doing something about it. That's what matters most." As Miranda left the coffee shop, she felt a strange sense of relief. The conversation had been difficult, but it was a step forward, a chance to start anew. Later that evening, Ava sat by her window, watching the city lights twinkle against the darkening sky. Her mind replayed the encounter with Miranda, and a faint smile touched her lips. She reached for her notebook and jotted down a single line. "Even small steps can lead to meaningful change." It wasn't forgiveness that Miranda had earned, not yet. But she had earned something else, the opportunity to grow. For Ava, that was enough. And for Miranda, it was everything. The sun rose gently over the city, casting warm hues across the airline's headquarters. Inside, the conference room buzzed with quiet anticipation. Executives, task force members, and key staff gathered around a long table, papers and laptops ready for the day's agenda. Ava Carter sat at the head, her calm demeanor commanding attention. It had been months since the incident aboard Flight 287, and in that time, the airline had undergone significant changes. Ava's recommendations had led to the implementation of mandatory sensitivity and bias training, a restructured feedback system for passengers, and a more diverse hiring initiative. Today, they were unveiling the results of these reforms. "Thank you all for being here," Ava began, her voice steady but warm. "This isn't just about numbers or policies. It's about creating a culture where every passenger and employee feels valued, where they know they belong." She nodded to the head of HR, who began a presentation highlighting the progress. Employee feedback on the new training programs had been overwhelmingly positive, with many reporting greater awareness and empathy in their roles. Complaints of bias from passengers had decreased by 30% in the past quarter, a significant milestone. Clara, the young flight attendant who had shown Ava kindness, was now a senior staff member overseeing onboarding for new hires, ensuring the values Ava championed were instilled from day one. As the presentation continued, Ava's gaze lingered on the faces around the table. She could see the change, not just in the numbers, but in the people. They weren't just checking boxes, they were embracing the shift. Meanwhile, Miranda Scott prepared for her first day back on the job. After her suspension, she had completed her training and taken additional time to reflect and volunteer. The airline's disciplinary committee had reviewed her progress and reinstated her, though in a new role. Miranda's nerves buzzed as she adjusted her uniform in the mirror. This time, it wasn't about appearances. It was about living up to the promise she'd made to herself. Her new assignment placed her on a mentorship team, supporting younger staff and ensuring they upheld the company's values. It wasn't the position she'd held before, but it was one she was determined to embrace. Later that week, Ava found herself back on a plane, heading to a conference where she was set to speak about her experience and the changes it had inspired. As she boarded, she recognized a familiar face, Clara, now wearing a distinct senior badge on her crisp uniform. "Miss Carter," Clara said warmly, her eyes lighting up. "Welcome aboard. It's wonderful to see you again." "Likewise," Ava replied, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "How's the new role treating you?" "It's been amazing," Clara said. "I never imagined I'd be in this position, but I guess kindness really does go a long way." Ava's smile deepened. "I told you it matters." Clara led Ava to her first-class seat, ensuring she was comfortable before returning to her duties. The flight was uneventful, but Ava couldn't help reflecting on how far things had come. She thought of Miranda's apology, Clara's promotion, and the ripple effect of one moment of adversity. She glanced out the window at the endless sky, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction, not because the work was done, but because it had begun. On the ground, Miranda stood before a group of new hires, sharing her story as part of their orientation. She spoke openly about her mistakes, her biases, and the lessons she had learned. "I used to think professionalism was enough," she said, her voice steady. "But professionalism without empathy isn't worth much. We're here to serve people, all kinds of people. And the best way to do that is to see them. Really see them." The group listened intently, her vulnerability striking a chord. When the session ended, several attendees approached to thank her. Miranda left the room with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. 8 weeks later, Ava's task force delivered its final report to the airline's board of directors. Her father, Robert Carter, sat at the table's head, his pride evident. "You've done incredible work, Ava," he said after the presentation. "This company is better because of you." Ava shook her head slightly, her smile humble. "It's better because we listened and acted. That's what matters." But the changes Ava had fought for began to influence other airlines. Industry conferences invited her to speak, and organizations sought her advice on improving equity and inclusion. Through it all, Ava remained grounded, focused not on recognition, but on impact. The story of Flight 287 didn't fade into the background. It became a turning point. Employees referenced it during training sessions, executives cited it in board meetings, and passengers began sharing their own experiences, feeling empowered to speak up. For Ava, the incident became a reminder of the power of resilience and the ripple effects of standing firm in the face of injustice. For Miranda, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by perfection, but by effort, humility, and growth. As Ava boarded yet another plane weeks later, a thought struck her. The sky wasn't just a destination. It was a canvas, limitless and full of possibility. And with that, she smiled, ready for whatever came next.